Hello there and welcome. Tonight, let me gently guide you into the quiet corners of history, where time slows to a hush, the bustle of modern life fades into silence, and every tale is unravelled like a soft lullaby. So nestle into your favourite chair, close your eyes if you wish, and drift with me. This evening, we'll explore a tale that's rarely spoken of in the gentlest tones, the curious, grim, and at times almost unimaginable reality of hygiene in medieval times. Why was cleanliness such a difficult dream? Why did the streets reek and the rivers run brown? Tonight, in 24 whispered chapters, we'll uncover why hygiene was a nightmare in the Middle Ages. Let's begin. It is the 12th century. A village lies sleeping beneath a blanket of stars, tucked somewhere in the rolling countryside of England. A single thatched roof glimmers in the moonlight as wind rustles through the trees. All is quiet until the sharp buzz of flies and the slow, muffled sound of sloshing underfoot disturb the stillness. This was a time before the idea of clean as we know it, before antiseptic, before toilets flushed, before soap was commonplace. And so our story begins not with drama or war, but with a pail, a simple wooden pail sitting beside the door of nearly every home. They called it a garderobe in the castles, a chamber pot in the villages, or just the bucket, used at night, dumped each morning. If you lived in a town, it wasn't uncommon to see servants, or even housewives, open their upstairs windows and tip the contents of these pots onto the street below. One swift shout of "Guard a loo!" warned passers-by to move. Most didn't make it in time. The roads were made of dirt, often sunken from use, and the runoff had nowhere to go. Human waste mixed with that of animals, horses, pigs, stray dogs, creating rivulets that ran through alleyways like veins of filth. In the summer, the smell thickened in the heat. In the winter, it simply froze into crusted mounds, only to thaw again come spring. There was no sewage system to speak of, at least not for the majority. A few lucky towns inherited ancient Roman drains or aqueducts, but most had long since crumbled. The knowledge that had once carved marvels from marble was now mostly forgotten, and so the rivers became the default solution, places to bathe, to dump, to drink, all at once. The very idea of separating clean from unclean hadn't taken hold yet. In fact, to medieval minds, dirt itself was not always a sign of danger. It was life. Soil, sweat, the scent of the body, these were natural things. Some even believed that bathing too often weakened you, that water opened the pores, allowing sickness to slip in. And so people rarely washed. Not for lack of desire, but for lack of access. Soap, when it was available, was made with harsh lye and animal fat, and it stung the skin. Hot water required firewood, a scarce resource for many. Bathhouses existed in cities, but they were sometimes seen more as places of sin than sanitation. Instead, one might change into a fresh shift, a linen undergarment to feel clean, or rub the skin with cloth and sprinkle fragrant herbs, rosemary, thyme, lavender, cloaking the scent, not removing it. Fleas were accepted, lice were combed through, boils and sores were treated with poultices of wine or honey or moss, sometimes even crushed pearls. But this was daily life. And within that life there were rhythms, customs and beliefs that made sense to those living it. You see, we mustn't fall into the trap of thinking these people were foolish. Their knowledge was shaped by what they saw, by what was passed down by the world they inherited. Illness was often seen as divine punishment, not bacterial invasion. If your child fell ill after a bath, perhaps it wasn't the dirty water, but a test from God. If your neighbour survived a plague outbreak, perhaps it was because she prayed harder, not because she lived uphill from the contaminated stream. And so rather than pipes and filters, people turned to charms and amulets. They clutched dried flowers to their chests, believing them to purify the air. They burned juniper and resin, smoked their rooms with incense. Cleanliness became spiritual, symbolic rather than physical, and the consequences were dire. Plagues spread swiftly through tight, cramped neighbourhoods, leprosy, dysentery, typhoid, yet even then most didn't see the connection. They feared bad air, miasmas, the invisible fogs of rot and death, not the microbes themselves. A sneeze might be explained by astrology, a cough by imbalance of the humours. Still, there were voices who questioned, monks who observed patterns, physicians who recorded symptoms, engineers who studied the old Roman aqueducts with awe. There were beginnings, quiet ones, of a future we now take for granted. But for most, medieval hygiene remained not just a challenge, but a nightmare. As you drift now into the shadows of sleep, picture the narrow cobbled lanes, the candlelit windows, the quiet clatter of hooves over wet stone. This was a world not broken, not barbaric, just unaware. A world in which survival often meant enduring the unpleasant with grace, or pretending not to smell it at all. But this is only the beginning. There are deeper wells to draw from and darker corners yet to visit. In our next chapter, we'll step into the heart of the medieval city and listen to its pulse, echoing through filth and fog. For now, rest. Let the past settle softly in your thoughts. And when you're ready, we'll continue. The night deepens, and with it our descent into the labyrinth of the past. Outside, the world slumbers. Within, we open a creaking door into the belly of the medieval city, where narrow alleys twist like veins through stone and timber, and every breath feels thick with age. Let us step lightly, for beneath our feet lies a history hidden not in ink, but in filth. It is dawn in London. Not the London you know, no buses or steel towers, but one of soot-darkened walls and thatched roofs, pressed so close together the sky is barely visible from the streets below. As the first light pierces the haze, the city exhales. A symphony of human movement begins. Carts rumble, children shout, shutters creak open. But what rises first is the smell. Stale beer, damp straw, waste. The scent is a layered thing, not sharp like modern refuse, but old, lingering, like rot beneath perfume. You see, the medieval city had no lungs to cleanse it, no sweeping sanitation systems, only people doing their best with the little they knew. In these close quarters, hygiene became improvisation. Most homes had no internal plumbing, no running water. Instead, residents relied on public conduits, large stone basins connected to springs or wells. To gather water, one needed strength, patience, and often a long walk. Buckets were filled and balanced carefully, as spilling meant starting over. But these conduits served everyone: bakers, blacksmiths, midwives, men with horses, women with laundry. And though signs were posted, strict proclamations forbidding the washing of animal guts or soiled clothes near the spouts, they were seldom obeyed. Imagine the residue of daily life: blood from butchered pigs, entrails from fishmongers, thick curdled milk, soup bones, all making their way to the gutters and often into the conduits themselves. The streets, you must understand, were not merely roads. They were drains. In the middle of each lane, a shallow trench or gully ran down toward the river, designed to carry waste away. But it only worked if the streets were maintained, and most weren't. In wealthier parts of town, a tax called scavenge was collected to fund occasional street cleaning. But even then, sweeping was irregular and depended on the season, the weather, or the local lord's mood. In poorer districts, the gullies overflowed, thick with mud, refuse, offal, and worse. Dogs prowled freely, picking through the mire for scraps. Rats followed, fat and bold, nesting in thatched roofs or under floorboards. Children played barefoot in the lanes, unaware of the infections hiding beneath their toes. And all the while, the population grew. By the 14th century, cities like Paris and London were swelling beyond their limits. People poured in from the countryside seeking work, refuge, or opportunity. Houses were subdivided, inns doubled their beds, families shared single rooms, their breath fogging the same air. With so many bodies packed into such small spaces, the city began to fester. Public latrines were rare and often dangerous. Many were little more than pits dug beside rivers or in the woods beyond the town walls. Some hung over the water itself, perched precariously above the flow. Others were built into bridges, their contents plummeting into the currents below. But even these weren't enough. Enter the gong farmers, men tasked with the most revolting job imaginable, the removal of human waste from privies and cesspits. They worked mostly at night, hauling the night soil away by torchlight. Clad in leather and reeking of their trade, they were shunned by polite society, but they were essential. Without them, the pits would overflow, seeping into basements, into gardens, into wells. It's strange, isn't it? How a city can be vibrant and vile all at once. In the same breath, you'd find scholars debating philosophy and pigs rooting in sewage, merchants counting coin beside open cesspits, a cathedral rising skyward above streets choked with rot. And yet, despite it all, the medieval city was alive. It sang with markets, festivals, sermons, births. It dreamed, but it also suffered. Plagues, when they came, found perfect fuel in these cities. Filth gave them legs. When the Black Death arrived in 1348, it tore through the population with terrifying speed. Entire streets were emptied in days. The stench of death joined the already thick air. Mass graves were dug on the city's edge, wide trenches filled and refilled. Did the people make the connection between filth and death? Some did. As panic gripped the city, King Edward III ordered the streets of London to be cleansed. For the scent, he said, offended God and man alike. Laws were passed banning the slaughter of animals within city walls. Butchers were pushed to the outskirts. Latrines were inspected. It was a beginning, small, hesitant, but a sign that minds were shifting. Still, old habits clung. Water was still drawn from tainted sources. Waste still flowed through alleys. The balance between what people needed and what they understood had not yet tipped. Now as we walk slowly from this city, its stone walls behind us, its cries growing faint, take one last look, not with judgment but with wonder. For every slab of mud hides a story, every corner a quiet resilience. This was not a world of ignorance, but of limits, of tradition, belief and survival. In our next journey, we'll venture beyond the city, into the fields and forests where peasants carved out life with dirt beneath their nails and the sky as their only witness. But for now, hush! Let the fog roll in, let the torches dim, and let sleep carry you gently forward, deeper into the folds of time. Beyond the crowded city walls, past the echo of church bells and the murmur of market stalls, lies a quieter world. It is not clean, far from it, but it breathes differently. Here in the countryside, where fields roll like rumpled linen and forests whisper secrets to the wind, another chapter of our story unfolds. It is early morning. Mist clings low over the grass like a veil, and somewhere a rooster calls, its cry soft and cracked, like an old song repeated 1,000 times. We find ourselves near a small hamlet, no more than a handful of timber homes clustered along a dirt road. Smoke curls from a chimney. A dog stirs, stretches and settles again beside a wooden fence. This is the world of the medieval peasant, simple, rugged and intimately tied to the earth. Yet even here, far from the stench of the cities, hygiene was no easier. The average peasant family lived in what we might now call a longhouse, a one-room structure built of wattle and daub, its floor of packed earth, its roof low and thatched. At one end the family lived, at the other their animals, chickens, goats, perhaps a cow or two. They shared not just space but air, warmth and parasites. In the dark corners, fleas nested in straw bedding, mice nibbled on grain sacks. The scent of manure was constant, though never remarked upon. It was simply life. Cleanliness, as we imagine it, soap and scrubbing, bright rooms and fresh linens, was not a goal, but a luxury most had never dreamed of. Bathing, too, was a rare occasion. Not because the streams didn't flow or rain didn't fall, but because bathing took time. Effort, fuel, a fire must be built, water drawn and heated. A tub, if one was lucky enough to own such a thing, dragged out and filled. Most often, it wasn't worth it. A rinse in a cold stream was quicker, but only in the warmer months. In winter, water turned to ice, and skin was scrubbed only with cloth or straw. Instead, much like their city cousins, peasants relied on the practice of changing clothes to feel clean. A fresh linen shift, a new woolen tunic. These, if available, gave a sense of renewal. Soap was rare. When it could be found, it was homemade, rendered from animal fat and wood ash, gritty and caustic. It could whiten cloth but left hands raw. Hands, those instruments of survival, were calloused, cracked and stained with earth. They milked cows, pulled weeds, churned butter, dressed wounds. There was little distinction between clean and unclean labour. A mother might swaddle her infant moments after scraping dung from the stable floor. It was all necessary, and necessity often outpaced comfort. Toilets, of course, were unheard of in such villages. The term would not have meant anything. Instead, people used the edges of the fields, the forest, or a simple pit dug behind the house. In some homes, especially in colder climates, a corner of the room was set aside, a bucket or a trench beneath a wooden seat. These makeshift privies were emptied by hand. Flies buzzed, odours lingered. But again, there was no outrage. It was all part of the cycle. And what of water? Wells were the lifeblood of the village. A single one might serve dozens of families. Drawn with rope and bucket, the water was stored in wooden barrels or jugs. It was rarely boiled. That required precious fuel. Instead, it was drunk as is, cloudy or not. Sometimes it tasted of iron, other times of something sour or unfamiliar. When people fell ill, they blamed the wind, the stars, or perhaps a curse, not the water. Rivers and streams were more than just sources of hydration. They were places to wash clothes, rinse vegetables, cool off in summer. But they were also used for disposal of waste, of animal remains, of anything unwanted. A pig's entrails here, a bloodied rag there. The current carried it all away, out of sight, out of mind. Disease was a constant, quiet companion. Children died young, of fevers, of stomach sickness, of strange rashes no one could name. Coughs lingered through the seasons. Skin infections festered untreated. Herbal remedies were passed down through generations. Chamomile tea, elderberry syrup, poultices made of moss and clay. Some worked, others did not. And yet, in the midst of all this, there was resilience. Not ignorance, not neglect, but endurance. These people were not careless. They were surviving within a world that had not yet offered them the tools to do more. Their understanding of cleanliness was tied to the land, to the seasons, to the body as a vessel of toil. Washing was often spiritual, a ritual act before a feast day or a church service, a form of respect not just toward others but toward God. On holy days, villagers would line up at the stream, scrubbing faces, feet, hands, not daily, not even weekly, but meaningfully. Clothing, too, held layers of meaning. A clean tunic on a festival day was a statement. I am present, I am worthy, I am not undone by the mud. And while we might recoil at the thought of such a life, we must remember, this was the norm. No one thought it strange that lice were combed from a child's hair each morning, or that the same hands prepared food and treated wounds. This was life, ordinary, rugged, and deeply human. As the day fades from the village and smoke once more curls from the chimneys, we leave the peasants to their rest. A baby cries in the distance. An owl calls from the woods. The earth, rich and dark, accepts another offering. In our next journey, we'll rise above, to the grand halls of kings and queens, where gilded tapestries and silken robes could not quite mask the very same problems that plagued the peasant's floor. But for now, hush. Let the fields grow still. Let your breath slow with the wind and sleep, knowing the past is gently watching. Let us now leave the simple life of the countryside behind. The humble longhouses, the quiet streams, the rhythm of toil beneath open skies, they fade like smoke in the distance. Tonight we travel upward, into a world of stone towers and velvet drapes, into castles, cold vast, echoing with power and secrets. It is time to speak of royalty, of lords and ladies, of kings who commanded armies and queens cloaked in brocade. But even here, in the gilded chambers of privilege, hygiene was a quiet torment. It is evening in a grand castle perched atop a crag. The walls are thick, carved of grey stone and covered in ivy. A cold wind sweeps through the halls, tapestries flutter, the rushes on the floor rustle underfoot, a tangled mix of straw, dried herbs and filth. In the great hall, a fire blazes in a hearth taller than a man. Long wooden tables are scattered with the remnants of a feast. Bones, crusts, grease-smeared trenchers made of stale bread. Dogs roam freely, licking up scraps. Servants rush back and forth, clearing plates, pouring wine. A nobleman in fur robes leans back, full and warm. And yet, behind the luxury, behind the silk and silver, the smell still lingers. You see, castles were magnificent in vision, but primitive in practice. Though built to intimidate, to inspire awe, their infrastructure was still bound by the same earthly needs as the peasant's hut. Waste had to go somewhere. Water had to be fetched. Disease, when it came, did not knock more gently on the castle door. Toilets in castles were called garderobes, a French word meaning wardrobe, oddly enough, because people often kept their clothes near them. The ammonia from human waste was thought to repel fleas and moths. A garderobe was little more than a small chamber, often tucked into the thickness of the wall. It featured a hole in a stone or wooden seat which dropped directly into a pit, or, if the castle was conveniently placed, over a moat or cliffside. Some garderobes were more elaborate, designed with sloped chutes and chiselled drains, but they still stank. The smell crept into halls, into tapestries, into beds. Cleaning them was no small task, done rarely and only by servants whose names history does not record. In winter, the cold turned these stone closets into icy prisons. In summer, they became furnaces of foul air. Some lords preferred chamber pots, ornate, painted, made of metal or ceramic. but they still required emptying. Often these were tossed from high windows despite laws against it, creating a dangerous surprise for anyone passing below. Bathing, too, was complicated. Though Roman customs had once included heated baths and flowing water, much of that knowledge had been lost by the Middle Ages. What remained was patchwork, a blend of superstition, scarcity, and effort. Royalty might bathe a few times a year, especially on feast days or after long journeys. When they did, it was an event. A wooden tub would be brought into the chamber, lined with cloth. Buckets of hot water were carried in from the kitchens. Perfumed oils were added. Musicians might play softly nearby. Curtains were drawn around the tub, both for warmth and modesty. Yet for all its ritual, the bath was still brief. The water cooled quickly. Soap, if used, was harsh and often avoided on delicate skin. Instead, fragrant powders and scented cloths were preferred. Linen towels were rubbed over the body. Rosewater dabbed on the neck and wrists. Hair was rarely washed. It took hours to dry. Instead, it was combed with fine-toothed bone or ivory combs, often dipped in oil or crushed herbs. Fleas and lice were picked out carefully, a task usually done by a lady-in-waiting or servant. Clothing helped maintain the illusion of cleanliness. Linen undergarments absorbed sweat and were changed more frequently than outer garments. They were boiled and scrubbed, while gowns and cloaks might go unwashed for months or even years. Some fabrics like velvet and brocade were too costly to clean and were simply brushed, aired, or perfumed. And what of the castle kitchens? They were grand but chaotic, smoky, loud, teeming with labour. Meat hung from hooks. Fish was gutted beside flour sacks. Rats were not strangers here, nor were insects. Dishes were rinsed in shared tubs. Hands were wiped on aprons. There were no gloves, no refrigeration. Salt was the great preserver, and even then, food spoiled quickly. Illness was often blamed on excess, not infection. A nobleman who fell ill after a feast might be told his humours were unbalanced, too much bile, not enough blood. He might be bled with leeches, or given a concoction of herbs, honey and vinegar. Doctors were few, and knowledge was hazy. The body was still a mystery. And so people leaned on faith, ritual and instinct. Perfume was a favourite remedy, for the nose at least. Sweet-smelling sachets were worn on belts, tucked into sleeves, pinned to hair. Nobles believed that pleasant scents warded off bad air, the infamous miasmas that were thought to carry disease. Thus, the cleanest were not always the healthiest, nor the healthiest the cleanest. The castle, for all its grandeur, was a place of contradiction. Opulence and squalor danced side by side. Gold leaf shimmered on altar books, while rats nested in the rafters. Silken sheets covered straw-filled mattresses. Tapestries whispered stories of saints, while garderobes whispered something else entirely. And yet, it was a home, a fortress, a symbol of stability in an unstable world. Tonight, as the fire in the great hall fades to embers and the servants extinguish torches along the stone corridors, listen closely. You might hear the slosh of a chamber pot being carried down the steps, the squeak of a comb through tangled hair, the murmur of a prayer before bed. In our next journey, we'll descend even deeper into the monasteries and infirmaries where cleanliness met faith and sickness tested the soul. But for now, let the torches dim, let the draught grow still, and let sleep press its fingers gently against your eyelids as the castle fades into dream. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world lies suspended between breath and memory, we arrive at a different kind of refuge. Not a village, not a city, not a castle of kings or the huts of the humble, but a sanctuary of silence, cloistered behind high walls, where prayers echo in stone corridors and time itself seems to kneel. Tonight we enter the monastery, a place where devotion, discipline and reflection shaped every hour of the day, and where, curiously, hygiene was both a sacred ritual and a forgotten burden. The monastery breathes a rhythm all its own. A bell tolls softly in the dark. A line of robed figures moves silently through the cloister, their heads bowed, feet bare, or wrapped in worn sandals. Each step measured, deliberate. This is the Matins hour, the first of many prayers that will mark the day. Monks lived simply. Their lives were ruled by the regula benedicti, the rule of Saint Benedict, a code of conduct written in the 6th century and followed by many monastic orders throughout the medieval world. It called for order, for humility, for balance between prayer and labour. And in that balance, A surprising degree of attention was paid to cleanliness, but not always in the ways we might expect. Each monastery had its own customs, shaped by geography, wealth, and local tradition. Some were grand, with flowing aqueducts and separate bathhouses. Others were sparse, with nothing more than a cold basin and a bucket. Still, most included a place called the lavatorium, a communal wash area. Imagine a long stone trough, perhaps beneath an arched alcove in the cloister. Fresh water trickled through bronze spouts, fed by nearby springs or rudimentary plumbing. Before meals, monks gathered there to wash their hands, a ritual both spiritual and practical. Silence was observed. Eyes were lowered. The act of washing was one of humility, not vanity, but full-body bathing, that was another matter. Some orders allowed it only a few times a year on feast days or holy celebrations. Others permitted more, especially if the monk was elderly or ill. Baths, when they occurred, were often done communally, in quiet. No indulgence, no laughter. Nudity was frowned upon, even among brothers. Modesty was not just moral, but sacred. And so many monks lived in a kind of balanced uncleanliness, not filthy, but not fastidiously clean either. Garments were simple: a tunic, a scapular, a hood. Linen undergarments were changed and laundered when possible, but resources were shared. In poorer abbeys, a monk might own only one set of clothes, washing them only during fasts, wearing them damp as they dried. Beds were narrow, made of straw or hay. Rooms were shared. There was little privacy. And yet the environment was calmer than the city, more orderly than the manor, more hygienic, at least on the surface. But the monastery too had its hidden shadows. Food scraps were dumped in pits. Waste from latrines was gathered in cesspools or directed into streams that often ran near the kitchens and gardens. Some monasteries built reredatas, long latrine buildings attached to dormitories with seats aligned over chutes or water channels. Others still relied on chamber pots, emptied into nearby ditches. Cleaners, often novices or lay servants, took on these humble tasks in silence. It was seen as penance, work that cleansed the spirit, if not the floor. Infirmaries were a central feature of most abbeys. Here the sick were treated with herbal brews, poultices and whispered prayers. Monks who had studied old texts, Galen, Hippocrates and later Arabic scholars, acted as healers. They believed in balancing the four humours: fever, bloodletting; cough, a syrup of sage; wound, honey and wine, if available. Cleanliness in the infirmary was observed more carefully. Linens were washed more often, wounds rinsed with warm water, tools, such as they were, wiped with cloths soaked in vinegar or wine. There was an intuitive understanding that dirt could worsen suffering, that a foul room could bring fever, but without knowledge of their actions were half blind, half wise. And there were moments, rare but recorded, when monks challenged the boundaries of what was known. One might observe that a stream running near the latrine smelled stronger in summer and that illness followed. Another might notice that those who cleaned their hands more often grew ill less frequently. But such thoughts were scattered, fragile and easily lost in the rigidity of ritual. Monks also bathed their souls. Confession, penance, fasting, these were daily hygiene for the spirit. And so bodily cleanliness often became symbolic: washed hands, a pure heart, a clean robe, a disciplined life. But the contradictions remained. A monastery could be a place of immense peace and crawling lice, a haven of prayer where illness spread in silence. The same brother who illuminated sacred texts by candlelight might carry fleas in his robes. The same hands that lifted a chalice might also tend to a rotting wound. And through it all they endured, quietly, faithfully. Outside the thick stone walls, the world spun in chaos: famine, war, plague. But within, time moved with a different purpose. One footstep after another, one prayer after another. Hygiene was not a pursuit, it was a rhythm. Now, as the bell tolls once more and the monks file into the chapel for Lauds, we step back. The cloisters empty behind us, the candles flicker. The wind carries with it the scent of lavender and old wax. In our next journey we'll return to the people, but not in homes or castles. We'll walk the open roads, alongside those who wandered not for trade or faith, but for survival. Vagrants, pilgrims, outcasts, carriers of both stories and sickness. But for now, breathe gently, let the echo of chanted psalms lull you, and sleep as the ancient stones dream beneath moonlight. The path stretches before us now, narrow and worn, a ribbon of mud threading through field and forest. It is neither town nor village we find ourselves in tonight, but somewhere in between, a place of movement, of passage, of fleeting footprints and whispered names. The open road, where the lost, the searching and the forsaken walk in silence, carrying little more than what clings to their backs. Tonight we walk beside them, the vagrants, the pilgrims, the lepers and the beggars, the ones history often forgets, though their shadows linger still. A cold wind presses through the trees. The stars blink dimly through shifting clouds. A cloaked figure trudges ahead, limping slightly, boots wrapped in cloth, a sack slung over one shoulder. The road beneath his feet is slick, and the air carries the smell of damp earth and old leather. Travel in the Middle Ages was not for the faint of heart, and hygiene, if it existed at all, was a flicker against the wild dark. Pilgrims were perhaps the most common travellers, men and women from every walk of life, setting out on sacred journeys to holy sites, Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, even Jerusalem. Some walked to fulfill vows, others to seek healing, a few to escape. Their clothes were simple, woolen cloaks, tunics, belts. Many bore badges or tokens to mark their pilgrimage, scallop shells for Compostela, crosses for Jerusalem. Their shoes wore thin quickly, and many walked barefoot in penance. Food was begged or bought, shelter found in barns, inns or under trees. Rivers were bathed in when possible, otherwise filth accumulated in layers, sweat, dust, lice. Yet no one judged. The dirtier the pilgrim, the holier the journey. But not all travellers were pilgrims. There were others on the road, outcasts cast loose from their homes, accused of theft, heresy, or simply poverty. Vagrants wandered in search of work, food, or warmth. Some carried tools, a knife, a needle, a spade, offering their labour in exchange for bread. Others carried nothing. Their hygiene was survival, streams to rinse the face, rain to wash the skin, a fire, if one could be built, to burn lice from a shirt. They slept in ditches beneath hedgerows, in churchyards when the priests allowed it. Their smell often preceded them. So did suspicion. And then there were the lepers. Feared, exiled, misunderstood. The disease, what we now call Hansen's disease, was poorly understood. Its symptoms varied: skin lesions, numbness, disfigurement, but its effect on society was absolute. Those diagnosed were banished, both physically and spiritually. Many lepers were sent to live in isolated colonies or hospitals known as leprosaria. These were often situated outside city walls, beyond bridges, deep in rural pockets. There they lived together, cared for at times by monks or nuns, but just as often neglected. Some still wandered. They wore cloaks marked with symbols, a bell, a wooden clapper, a cross, to warn others of their approach. Lepers were forbidden from touching others, from entering markets or churches. They spoke softly, kept distance, and carried their own utensils. The very sound of their bell sent people scrambling, not because the disease was understood, but because it terrified. And yet, even the leper washed in rivers, in rain with tears. Some believed their illness was punishment for sin, for pride, for unknown offences. They prayed, they fasted. They sought not just physical healing, but forgiveness. In all these wanderers, pilgrim or pariah, hygiene was not a routine, but an occasional mercy. A stolen moment in a stream, a warm rock on which to dry a shirt, a piece of soap passed from hand to hand, treasured like silver. They told stories, these travellers, of roads where no birds sang, of kindly abbots who shared wine and basins, of cruel lords who beat them for stealing water, of other pilgrims, old, blind, coughing, who died quietly beneath trees, wrapped in their cloaks, their bodies never washed again. Disease travelled with them, from village to village, from town to town, not by intent, but by necessity. The plague did not spare the road, nor did dysentery, lice, scabies, or festering wounds. They spread with every footstep. Still, they walked, because they had to, because standing still meant hunger, because somewhere they hoped there would be relief. There were roadside shrines, places of prayer and pause. There were wells said to hold healing water. Some towns welcomed pilgrims with hospitality. Others barred their gates at the first sight of a tattered cloak. And among them all, there was no shame in dirt. Only the unspoken understanding that suffering was part of the journey. That aching feet, empty bellies, and unwashed skin were signs not of failure, but of endurance. As the stars shift overhead and the fire beside the road fades to embers, we leave the wanderers to their rest. A dog curls beside a sleeping child. A woman adjusts the cloak around her feet. Somewhere in the dark, a bell rings once, soft and lonely. In our next passage, we will descend into the deepest dread of all, the arrival of plague. Not just once, but again and again, reshaping how people thought of filth, of bodies, of death itself. But for now, breathe with the wind, let the road grow quiet behind you, and sleep as if beneath an open sky with stars to keep you company. The night is heavy now, thick with silence and a stillness that seems to hold its breath. There is a hush in the trees, a pause in the earth. And from that silence, something ancient stirs. Not a whisper, not a sound, but a shadow. It creeps through cracks in doors, through alleys, through dreams. It has a name that echoes across centuries in a single shiver. Plague. Tonight, we step into the darkest chapter of our story. A time when hygiene was no longer just a discomfort or an inconvenience, but a matter of life and death, though few understood how or why. The year is 1348. The air is warm for spring, but there is something wrong in it. Something dense, sour, heavy. Word travels ahead of the sickness. Word always does. A ship, they say, docked in Messina with rats pouring from its hull. Men collapsed in the streets. Women coughed blood onto their aprons. Children died before their mothers' eyes. From Italy it spread, fast as wind, silent as thought, through France, Germany, England, carried by trade, by animals, by breath. They called it the Great Mortality. Later the Black Death. It began with fever, then swelling, large black boils in the neck, the armpits, the groin, then vomiting, bleeding, choking, and then silence. A third of Europe would perish. Entire villages emptied, fields lay fallow, the very air was blamed. They had no knowledge of bacteria, no understanding of the Yersinia pestis bacterium, or the fleas that clung to the backs of rats. But they knew death, and they knew filth. And so, in the chaos, hygiene began to matter in a new way. Cities reeked of corpses, houses boarded shut with entire families inside, already dead or dying. Mass graves were dug, and into this stinking panic came laws, proclamations, attempts, desperate and imperfect to bring order to decay. In London, the king ordered the streets cleaned. No more dumping chamber pots into alleys. No more butchering animals near public wells. Barbers, surgeons, tanners, all were pushed to the outskirts. Waste pits were filled. Bathhouses closed, then reopened, then closed again. In Paris, physicians wore strange beaked masks filled with herbs, rosemary, mint, cloves to filter the air. They believed bad smells carried the disease. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Their logic was flawed, but the instinct held a shadow of truth. People clutched bouquets of posies to their noses. They burned incense. They washed floors with vinegar. Some stripped naked and bathed in cold water, hoping to purge the sickness. Others refused to bathe at all, believing water opened the pores, a gateway for the plague to enter. In monasteries, monks bathed the dying. They changed linens more frequently, burned soiled garments, lit candles to purify the air. But many fell ill themselves. The monasteries were not spared. And the lepers, already outcast, now feared more than ever. Though they rarely spread the plague, they were seen as cursed. Some were driven out of their colonies, left to wander once more. There were those who sought answers in faith. Flagellants roamed from town to town, bands of men who whipped themselves in public, begging God for mercy. They believed the plague was punishment, and their blood might cleanse the world. And there were others, quieter, who began to notice patterns. That the poorest neighbourhoods suffered most, that those who drank from certain wells were more likely to fall ill, that the smell of rotting waste clung strongest to the homes of the dead. From these fragile threads an idea began to form. Not a clear one, not yet, but a sense, a feeling, that hygiene mattered, that water must be clean, that bodies must be washed, that homes must be aired, hands must be rinsed, waste must be buried. Some towns began building new conduits, designing rudimentary sewers, instituting fines for dumping refuse in public. A flicker of the future, dim, uncertain, but lit nonetheless. Still, most could not escape. The rich fled to country estates, but even the countryside was not safe. The poor died in heaps, in cellars, in barns, in fields. No one was untouched. And yet from the ashes something survived. A memory, a lesson. That cleanliness was not just virtue, but protection. The plague would return again in waves across centuries, and each time the fear would grow sharper. The air more suspect, the filth more feared. But so too did the desire to understand, to find meaning in the dirt, to battle death, not with prayer alone, but with water, with soap, with order. Now, as the church bells toll for the countless dead, and the wind carries the scent of both sage and sorrow, we step back. The graveyard is full, the sky is silent, and the streets are washed, not in water, but in absence. In our next journey, we'll peer into the delicate world of childhood, what it meant to be born into filth, to grow amid lice and illness, to face the world before words in a time when survival was never promised. But for now, let the morning quieten. Let your breath slow with the wind, and sleep as the lanterns dim, in the shadow of a world forever changed. Morning breaks gently over the village rooftops, casting long fingers of light through cottage windows and smoke-stained rafters. But for one house, it is not the fire or the rooster that stirs the silence. It is the cry of a newborn. Tonight we leave behind the corridors of plague and prayer and step into the fragile beginning of life. Into the nursery, if such a word may be used, though in truth it was often no more than a shared bed, a warm corner, a cradle carved by a father's hand. This is the world of children, of small limbs wrapped in linen, of lullabies sung over dirt floors, of innocence born into a world where hygiene was a stranger. A baby in medieval times arrived not to sterility, but into survival. Childbirth was a matter of blood and breath and instinct. It took place in the home, attended not by doctors, but by women, midwives, mothers, neighbours. They brought with them herbs, cloths, prayers and stories. Not medical knowledge, but experience passed through hands and generations. There were no sterilised tools, no gloves, no clean beds. The birthing mat was laid where there was space, beside the hearth perhaps, or in the loft. The woman laboured surrounded by the scent of smoke, sweat, straw, and whatever lingered in the corners of the room. Water was heated, but not always clean. Cloth was boiled when firewood allowed. If the birth was successful, and many were not, the child was wrapped quickly in swaddling bands, binding the limbs tightly to keep them straight and still. This wrapping could last for months, loosened only to wash or change. But washing was rare. The baby's body was cleaned gently with cloth. No soap, just water or wine if one could afford it. The umbilical stump was covered in ashes, oil or ground herbs to ward off infection. And then the child was laid in a cradle, or more often brought into the shared bed, beside mother and siblings and even the family dog. The air inside the home was thick, no windows opened wide. No breeze swept through. Chimneys were rudimentary or absent entirely. The smoke of cooking fires hung low in the rafters. Soot settled into every crack, onto every pillow, and into this space, children grew. Their skin, soft and vulnerable, was exposed to lice, to fleas, to the bacteria that lingered on hands, on clothes, on wood. It was common for infants to develop rashes, sores or coughs that never quite left. Diapering, in the way we understand it, did not exist. Infants were swaddled, and their waist soaked into the cloth. Changes were infrequent, not from neglect, but from scarcity. Cloth was precious. Washing took effort. Water had to be hauled and heated. Soiled bands were often hung to dry and reused. And yes, the smell lingered. In noble houses, the process was the same, though the wrappings were finer and the hands more practiced. A wet nurse might tend to the baby and a servant wash the cloths. But the air, the risk, the germs, they were the same. Because no title could ward off disease. As the child aged, the dangers only grew. Teething was feared, not just endured. Many believed that the process of new teeth could trigger fever, convulsions, even death. Herbs were boiled, amulets were tied around tiny wrists, charms whispered near cradles. Children were weaned young, often before they were ready, because the mother needed to return to work, to the fields, to the loom. Gruel made of wheat or barley was spooned into small mouths, sometimes soaked bread, sometimes milk if the cow was still producing. But everything was touched by hands that had not been washed. A child with diarrhea could fade within days. No one spoke of germs. No one understood hydration, only that some babies thrived and some did not. And yet, amid all of this, children laughed. They toddled through the mud, barefoot and wide-eyed. They tugged at chickens, chased each other with sticks. They listened to stories beside the hearth, their hair tangled, their noses running, their faces bright. Cleanliness was not measured in soap, but in smiles. Health was not constant, but hope was. Every child who survived was a miracle, a light against the dark. And their mothers, tired, aching, resilient, held them close, knowing how fragile breath could be. In noble homes, tutors might one day teach the child to read. In villages, they would learn to weed a garden, to fetch water, to knead dough. But before any of that came years of illness, of boils, of coughs, of lice, not feared, not hidden, just part of life. Even in death, children were wrapped lovingly, in linen if it could be spared. In prayers, always, they were laid in the earth near the church, near their ancestors. And another child was born. And another. It was an endless circle, quiet, painful, full of love. As we step away from the cradle and into the night once more, let us not remember only the filth. Let us remember the lullabies sung over sick beds, the soft cloths warmed by fire, the tears wiped away with the corner of an apron. In our next chapter, we shall visit the streets of trade, the marketplaces and taverns where merchants, travellers and workers rubbed shoulders and shared more than coin. A place where touch was constant and cleanliness, again, just out of reach. But for now, hush. Let the child sleep, let the fire crackle low, and let dreams carry you gently beyond the ache of the world. The sun now rises higher, casting golden light across cobbled streets and open squares. There is bustle in the air, a clatter of hooves, the creak of carts, the calls of vendors shouting over one another like gulls above a tide of people. Welcome to the marketplace. This too is a place where hygiene struggled to exist. Not hidden, not whispered, but bustling in full daylight beneath banners and bells and the ever-turning wheel of trade. In the heart of the medieval town, the market was its pulse. It beat with the rhythm of barrels rolling, goats bleating, spices wafting through the air, coins clinking in open palms. And along with the noise and colour came the smells, layered, dense, unforgettable. Fish, 3 days old, steaming beneath the sun. Cheese growing soft in its rind, crawling slightly at the edges. Raw meat strung up beside baskets of apples. Leather, iron, sweat and straw. But there was beauty too. Bunches of herbs tied in fragrant knots. Rosemary, sage, marjoram. Barrels of honey glistening with trapped flies. Bolts of wool dyed in rich indigo and ochre, their hues bleeding faintly onto the hands that touched them. The market was where everyone met. Lords and beggars, monks and minstrels, traders from distant lands. But in this place of mingling, of mouths shouting and hands exchanging, there were few thoughts given to what was left behind, or what was passed along. Sanitation in the marketplace was nearly non-existent. There were no drains beneath the stalls, no systems for refuse, the waste of animals, and there were many, soaked into the mud. Rotten produce was trampled underfoot or swept to the side. Slaughtered chickens were plucked where they fell. Blood pooled in the grooves between stones. And hands, oh the hands, they touched everything. A coin passed from one palm to another, a turnip chosen and dropped. A hunk of bread broken in two and handed to a child. Those same hands wiped sweat from brows, scratches from skin, or worse, mouths and noses without a second thought. Soap, if it existed in the stalls, was sold as luxury. A hard grey block scented with lard or ash, used for cloth, rarely for skin. Water was fetched from nearby wells, but it was brownish, tasted of metal. Vendors might rinse their produce in it. They did not wash their hands. And still, people came, day after day, crowding shoulder to shoulder. Because the market was more than food. It was news, it was gossip, it was survival. There were taverns nearby, of course. Low wooden structures with swinging signs and open doors. Within, the floors were layered with straw, meant to soak up spills, but also blood, spit and the occasional vomit. The tables were sticky, the mugs rarely cleaned. Ale was poured, bread shared, songs shouted. Taverns were homes for the travelling merchant, the lonely widow, the boasting soldier. They were warm, loud and filled with life, but they were not clean. Beds were shared, with strangers, with lice. The same blanket wrapped one guest after another. And if someone fell ill in the night, the sheets were shaken out, perhaps, but seldom scrubbed. Barmaids wiped tables with the same rag all evening. Drinks were passed from mouth to mouth. And in the back, near the chamber pot or the dung heap, pigs sometimes rooted through the refuse, unbothered. Yet there was charm too, the glow of lanterns swaying in the smoky air, the rhythm of a lute played by fingers rough from labour, the laughter that rose even when the world was hard. But diseases, once introduced, found the market a perfect stage. A cough could spread like a rumour. A cut hand wrapped in a dirty cloth could fester in days, pox, fevers, flux. These words were whispered often, feared more than thieves. When plagues came, markets emptied. or they didn't, and the sickness spread with every coin and cart. People began to wear charms, garlic around the neck, crystals sewn into collars, posies tucked into sleeves. Authorities tried, now and then, to impose rules. No selling meat in the sun, no dumping refuse near the well, fines were issued, stalls were torn down, but always the market returned, noisy, wild, unclean, because it had to. People needed to eat, to talk, to see one another, even in sickness. And so, amid the mire and the joy, the filth and the perfume, the marketplace lived. Tonight, as the last stall is covered with cloth and the coins are counted beneath flickering candlelight, let us step away. Let the voices fade. Let the scent of cinnamon and spoiled fish drift behind us. In our next journey, we will turn our eyes inward to the private realm of the body, to personal grooming, to how people touch their own skin, combed their hair, cleaned, or did not clean their teeth. But for now, breathe in the memory of the market's hum. Let it echo faintly as sleep folds over you, and rest knowing that even in chaos there was connection. Night falls softly, and with it comes stillness. The marketplace lies silent now, its stalls covered, its laughter gone quiet. Streets are empty, save for the soft scurry of a rat, the echo of a closing door, the hush that settles like dust upon stone. We step away from the noise, away from the crowds, and turn inward now, to the secret rituals of the self. To the body, to the face in the mirrorless washbowl, to the small, stubborn efforts made not for praise, but for dignity. Tonight we speak of personal grooming in the Middle Ages, the quiet war waged against filth, one comb stroke, one cracked fingernail at a time. There is no vanity here, not as we know it, but there is care, even tenderness. Imagine a wooden stool beside the hearth, a basin of lukewarm water resting on a table, a sliver of soap if fortune allows. A woman unwinds her hair, long and tangled from sleep. She dips a cloth into the water, wrings it out, and begins, forehead, cheeks, neck. No lather, no bubbles, just cloth and patience. In the absence of daily baths, the medieval person relied on spot cleaning known as a dry wash or partial wash. The hands, the face, the feet, these were tended to regularly. Not for appearance necessarily, but to feel less burdened by the dust of the road, the grease of the hearth, the long day. Hair was precious, a sign of status, of health, of virtue. It was rarely cut, especially for women, and almost never washed in the way we imagine. Instead, it was combed slowly, thoroughly. Combs were carved from bone, wood, horn, or ivory. Their teeth were fine and close, not for style, but for survival, to rid the scalp of lice, to remove nits. This was a daily task in many households, especially among the poor. One comb shared among many, wiped clean on cloth or rinsed in vinegar. Men, too, kept their hair in varying styles. A monk might be tonsured, the top of the head shaved in a ring to show devotion. A knight might keep his hair shoulder length, his beard trimmed with care. Barbers, though not always respected, were essential. They cut hair, trimmed nails, pulled teeth, and performed minor surgeries. They were not healers, but they touched the body more than most physicians ever dared. As for beards, they were symbols of masculinity, of status, of sometimes sanctity, but they too required maintenance. Shears were heated over the fire and used carefully. Lice hid in them, food clung to them, and so oils were used, not refined or scented, but made from rendered fat or pressed herbs, rubbed into the beard to soften it, to keep it tame. Teeth were another matter. To modern eyes, medieval dental hygiene seems almost non-existent. But this is not the whole truth. People did clean their teeth, though not with brushes. They chewed twigs from aromatic trees, fraying the ends into bristles. They rubbed their gums with cloth, sometimes dipped in vinegar, wine, or sage. Ashes from burnt rosemary or hazelnut shells were used like powder. Mouthwashes were concocted from mint or parsley steeped in water. There was no understanding of plaque, cavities, or bacteria. But there was a deep discomfort with pain. A rotten tooth was a source of agony, and extraction the only solution. The village barber or blacksmith might be called. A hot iron, a strong hand, and silence if you could manage it. Nails were kept short, not with clippers, but by biting, scraping, cutting with knives. Hands were stained with earth, ash, and grease. They were scrubbed with sand or straw, not for hygiene, but for function. To better grip, to avoid infection in wounds, to feel some sense of reset at day's end. Perfume, when used, was more common among the wealthy. Small bottles of rose water, lavender oil, or musk were dabbed behind ears, at the base of the neck, on linens. But even the poor had their scents. Bundles of dried herbs hung near beds, crushed leaves rubbed on wrists, a sprig of mint chewed before mass. For women especially, cleanliness was tied to modesty. A clean shift, a veiled head, well-kept hair, these were signs not only of beauty but of virtue. A woman who was too bold, too scented, too finely groomed might be whispered about. And yet none could deny the effort. The way she heated water before sunrise, the way she sewed fresh lavender into her hem. Children were harder to keep clean. They played in the mud, scratched at their skin, wiped their noses with sleeves. Mothers chased them with cloths, with combs, with boiled water. And always there were lice. There was no illusion of perfect cleanliness, but there was an enduring belief in maintenance, that the body must be tended like a garden, with what little one had, with time, with patience. And so beneath layers of grime and hardship there existed something deeply human, a desire to feel fresh, to start the day with clean hands, to greet the world with a combed head, a washed face, a sense, however fleeting, of control. Now, as the coals burn low and the cloth is hung to dry by the hearth, let us step back from the basin. Let the hair remain unbraided. Let the scent of rosemary linger in the air. In our next journey, we will turn to those who lived with more than dirt, those who bore the visible weight of illness on their skin, to the afflicted, the wounded, the marked. But for now, let your breath soften, let your fingers rest, and sleep as though your body too had been gently washed clean beneath the stars. The stars fade slowly as the horizon blushes with pale morning light. But tonight, we do not rise with the healthy, nor walk among the waking bustle of townsfolk or traders. Instead, we kneel at the edge of silence and step into the world of the afflicted. There were always those in medieval life who bore more than the weight of toil or poverty, those whose skin revealed their pain, whose bodies broke beneath unseen hands, who were marked by disease, by deformity, by wounds that never healed, and for whom hygiene was not just forgotten, but feared. This was the world of the sick. We begin in a small cottage where a woman sits by her son. His skin is flushed, his breath shallow. A rash has bloomed across his legs, angry, blistered, foul-smelling. The mother soaks cloth in boiled wine, presses it gently to the sores, murmurs prayers. She has no salve that works, no coin for a physician, only warmth, only patience, only the desperate hope that cleanliness might hold death at bay. Wounds in the medieval world were dangerous things. Even a small cut, if left to fester, could swell, blacken, and end a life. There were no antiseptics, no knowledge of sterilisation. But people tried, with wine, with honey, with brine. They washed wounds with vinegar when they could. They burned herbs to smoke the room. They cleaned pus with strips of linen, often reused. And always, they feared infection, even if they had no word for it. Hospitals existed, though they were nothing like the sterile halls we know today. They were more often places of refuge than recovery, run by monks or nuns, their floors swept with devotion, if not with soap. Beds were crammed close, curtains, if any, were stained. The air was thick with incense and the sounds of prayer, of breath, of suffering. There was some cleanliness in intention. The sheets were changed when possible. Water was drawn and warmed. Bowels were emptied into buckets. Hands were washed, sometimes ritually, sometimes truly. But still, disease spread. Skin diseases were most feared. Rashes, boils, disfigurements, pox, scrofula, the so-called king's evil, believed to be curable only by a monarch's touch. Leprosy, again, a show over every town wall. Those afflicted were often cast out, made to live beyond the borders, given small allowances of food or not. Sometimes they were housed in leper houses, rudimentary shelters far from city gates. Sometimes they simply vanished into the woods. And yet, not all were forgotten. There were caretakers, humble, tired, brave, women who soaked linens every night, monks who boiled bandages even when the firewood was low, midwives who knew which herbs soothed a rash, healers who tried over and over again to clean what could not be cured. For many illnesses, the signs were on the skin. Scabs, ulcers, weeping sores. To touch such things was both courageous and dangerous, and so gloves were rare, hands were bare. Faith was their armour. Bathing, when it could be done, was sacred, not frequent, not elaborate, but a basin of warm water, a sponge, a cloth, These were acts of kindness, to wipe a fevered brow, to rinse a suppurating wound, to make someone feel human again, if only for an hour. The ill often wore the same clothes for weeks. Their hair grew matted, their breath soured. But someone, if they were lucky, would brush the hair, rub oil into the scalp, change the straw beneath them. In monasteries, the rule of Benedict instructed brothers to care for the sick as they would for Christ himself. And so some of the earliest hygienic routines in Europe were born from mercy, from faith. Those with chronic illness lived on the edges. They developed habits to manage their conditions, rinsing sores in streams, chewing herbs to mask breath, hiding disfigurements with cloth. They knew where the cleanest springs flowed. They knew which baker might give them a crust of bread. They learned how to avoid stares, and always the question lingered. Was sickness a punishment, a test, a curse? Some believed it was the devil, others imbalance of the humours. Too much heat, too little blood, bad air, bad water, bad fortune. The truth was not yet born, but the instinct to clean, to soothe, to care, it lived. Now, as dawn breaks fully, and the sick room dims in contrast to the sun outside, we leave them gently. Their world is slower, softer, laced with the scent of crushed yarrow and boiled linen. In our next journey, we will explore the rituals of death, the final acts of care, the washing of bodies, the burial rites that tried to make clean what the world had dirtied. But for now, hush. Let the bowl cool beside the bed. Let the fevered breath slow. And sleep, as if someone tenderly pressed a damp cloth to your brow just once before the dream took hold. The wind moves softly through the graveyard grass. It carries no voices, no laughter, only the long sigh of memory. Here, beneath ancient stones and crooked crosses, beneath mounds of earth marked with wood or left unmarked entirely, the final chapter of every medieval life is written. Tonight we speak of death, of what happens to the body after breath has fled, of how hygiene, so often neglected or misunderstood in life, was sometimes found strangely in death. It begins quietly. A loved one notices the stillness, a hand that no longer grips, eyes that do not blink, and the room, however small, becomes a place of passage. There was no morgue in the Middle Ages, no funeral parlour. The home became the temple, the tomb, the chapel of the moment. The body was kept inside for a day, perhaps two, longer in winter, less in summer. The heat did not forgive delay, but before burial, something important happened, something sacred. The washing. It was almost always women who performed it. Mothers, wives, daughters. They heated water over the hearth, laid out clean cloths, lit candles to soften the shadow of fear. With reverence, they undressed the body, untying laces, unpinning cloaks, folding garments with care. They dipped linen into warm water mixed with rosemary, lavender, or vinegar, whatever was available. And gently they wiped the skin, the forehead now cool, the hands once calloused and sure. The feet worn from years of walking. This washing was not for vanity, it was for honour, for love, for ritual. They combed the hair, sometimes braiding it. They clipped the nails, tied the jaw shut with cloth, closed the eyes with coins or pressure. And if the body had been wounded by disease, marked by boils, ulcers or rot, they did what they could, not to fix it, but to cover it, to offer dignity in a world where it was often denied. Sometimes herbs were laid upon the chest, sometimes holy water sprinkled along the limbs. In wealthier homes, the body was dressed in a burial gown or in a monk's robe, even if the dead had never taken vows. For the poor, a simple shroud, linen if there was enough, wool if there was not. And then the laying out. The body was placed upon a board, a bench, or sometimes just a table. A candle was lit at the head, and for a night, sometimes two, someone stayed with it. This was the wake, not a celebration, not yet, a vigil, a waiting. Prayers were whispered, psalms read. Sometimes, if grief allowed, stories were shared, memories passed from one mourner to another like folded notes. But always, someone watched, because the body was still vulnerable. To rats, to theft, to superstition. There were fears that the soul might not fully leave right away, that spirits lingered, that the dead might rise, if not in body, then in curse. And so silver was placed near the heart. Charms hung above the door. The bell rung 3 times at dawn, then came the burial. The church bell tolled. The village gathered. The body, now wrapped, was lifted into a simple coffin if one could be afforded, or carried on a bier uncovered beneath a canopy of linen. Through streets, across fields, toward consecrated ground, the grave was dug by hand. In some places, it was shallow, in others deeper, depending on the season and the soil. And as the body was lowered, the priest spoke words in Latin, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. There were no embalmings for common folk, no vaults, just earth, and the belief that what lay beneath would someday rise again, purified. But the earth remembered, it absorbed the unwashed, it took the lice, the disease, the sweat, the blood, and in return, it gave silence, rest. For wealthier families, burials occurred inside the church itself, beneath the stone floors, in crypts beside saints. But even there, the air did not stay clean. Even there, the smell of rot seeped through cracks in the floor. The dead were buried close together. When space ran out, older bones were exhumed and moved to ossuaries, chambers of stacked skulls and femurs arranged like mosaics of memory. And yet every burial, however modest, carried echoes of care. In a world where life was hard, short and dirty, the dead were bathed. It is perhaps one of the most tender contradictions of medieval life, that the body, neglected in health, was honoured in stillness, that the last touch was often the cleanest, that death, when it came, brought not only fear, but a moment of peace. Now, as the grave is filled, the candles extinguished, and the mourners walk slowly back across dewy grass, let us follow. Let us leave behind the silence of the burial ground and turn once more toward the world of the living. In our next journey, we will examine the rhythms of the seasons, how weather shaped hygiene, how winter froze water and summer brought stench, and how people adapted to the cycles of nature with the little they had. But for now, close your eyes, feel the weight of lin against your skin, and sleep as though your name were softly spoken one last time before the soil was placed above. The world of the Middle Ages moved not by the ticking of clocks, but by the rhythm of the earth, by the changing light, the thaw of frost, the swell of summer heat, and in each season hygiene took on a new shape, a new struggle. Tonight, we follow that cycle. Through snow and sun, mud and drought, and the quiet human efforts to stay clean beneath an ever-changing sky. We begin with winter. In the still, breath-frosted hush of December, the cold pressed hard against every wall. Water froze in the bucket before dawn, the well turned to ice. Rivers slowed, crusted over with brittle sheets. And with that cold came silence, not just in song or footstep, but in cleansing. Bathing in winter was rare, unbearable even. Heating water required wood, and wood was precious. Every log burned was a choice. Warmth or washing, food or fire, most chose survival. And so bodies remained layered beneath wool and linen, grime building beneath sleeves and along collars. Fingers stiffened with dirt that could not be scrubbed away. Hair remained bound, hidden beneath caps and hoods. Instead, people turned to dry remedies, ashes from the hearth, rubbed on palms to remove grease. Cloth brushed across skin, shaking out the worst of the sweat. Herbs tucked into beds, bay, lavender, pennyroyal to mask the scent of weeks unwashed. But winter had its mercy. The cold preserved food. It slowed rot. It froze waste in the streets, the refuse of animals, the slop from kitchen doors, even the contents of chamber pots tossed into the gutters. For a few brief months, the stench subsided, only to return with the thaw. Spring arrived, not with flowers, but with mud. The snow melted, and with it came everything the frost had hidden. Dead rats, spoiled food, waste long frozen into mounds now softened, broke apart and ran in brown rivulets down city alleys and village lanes. Water returned, yes, but clean water? That was another matter. Wells overflowed, rivers turned cloudy, heavy with runoff. People resumed washing, but hesitantly. A basin here, a stream there. Feet rinsed after walking through calf-deep mire. Clothes at last were aired, laid upon hedges, beaten with sticks, boiled if wood was plentiful. But spring also brought insects, fleas stirred, lice multiplied. Mosquitoes hatched in still water, bringing fever to those who slept with windows open in the warmth. Still, there was hope in the green. Nettles and wild garlic were gathered, not just for food, but to cleanse the blood, so they believed. Spring was a time for purging, fasting, drinking bitter tonics. People sought to clean not just their homes, but their bodies, inside and out. And then came summer. With it, the world bloomed and festered. The heat laid thick upon rooftops, meat spoiled by midday, fish turned sour, milk curdled before it could be drunk. And everywhere the smell of sweat, of refuse, of humanity pressed too close in cities with no air between the walls. Bathing returned in earnest. People waded into rivers, stripped down to underclothes, splashed cool water over flushed skin. Children played near streams. Men bathed beneath waterfalls. Women washed their hair, combed it dry in the sun. Bathhouses flourished, though not without suspicion. Some saw them as places of sin, others as oases. Inside, water was heated in great copper vats. Rooms were filled with steam, bodies scrubbed with cloths and oils, lice picked away, nails cleaned. Skin, if only for an hour, renewed. Yet even here, hygiene had limits. Water was reused between patrons, tools were not sterilised, diseases passed hand to hand, basin to basin. Still, it was a moment of relief, a pause in the heat. To cope with sweat, people changed shifts more often, perfumed themselves with rosewater, vinegar-soaked cloths, carried scented sachets, kept windows open, fans moving if they could afford such things. But the poor had no fans, no bathhouses. They soaked their feet in troughs, slept on rooftops, drank warm water and prayed the flies would leave them be. Autumn arrived not gently but with the smell of smoke. Leaves turned, fires were lit again, and the world shifted once more toward restraint. Washing slowed, linen was stored away, hands grew rougher, nails blackened with the soil of harvest. But the first chill brought something else, a return to modesty, to layers, to privacy. People covered more, breathed easier, and prepared, quietly, deliberately, for winter's return. Through each season, hygiene was never a certainty. It was a negotiation, a choice, a moment seized between the urgent demands of survival. People adapted with cloth, with ash, with steam, with prayer, and the world turned again. Now, as the final leaves drift past the window and a cold wind curls beneath the door, we pause. We've seen the year unfold in dirt and water, in heat and hardship. In our next journey, we'll enter the realm of magic and superstition, where cleanliness crossed into ritual and people turned to spells, charms, and ancient beliefs to keep their bodies safe from harm. But for now, rest. Let the seasons pass in your dreams and sleep like the fields in winter, waiting to bloom again. The fire crackles softly in the hearth, shadows dancing across stone walls as night deepens. Outside, the wind stirs the trees, but inside, the air is still. Still and thick with the scent of herbs, dried thyme, crushed mugwort, a whisper of smoke from rosemary tossed upon the coals. Tonight, we step into the unseen, into the realm of whispers, amulets and charms, a place where hygiene was not merely physical but spiritual, where the line between filth and evil blurred and cleansing became ritual. In the medieval mind, sickness was rarely just sickness. It might be the work of a curse, a wandering spirit, an imbalance of the stars, or the punishment for a sin long forgotten. And so the body was guarded not only with water and cloth, but with magic. Let us begin with the charm. Small, worn, kept close to the skin, a pouch tied around the neck, stitched shut with red thread. Inside, dried flowers, a sliver of bone, a prayer written on parchment. Some carried to ward off plague, others to prevent boils or fever or nightmares that left the body slick with sweat. Washing, too, could be enchanted. A bowl of water left under the full moon. A sprig of vervain stirred thrice widdershins. The sick bathed with whispered incantations, their limbs rinsed from head to toe, while someone recited blessings in a language older than Latin. Midwives knew these ways well. To protect a newborn, they might draw signs on the doors with chalk, wash the child in wine mixed with crushed fennel, hang iron scissors over the cradle to keep away spirits. The first bath of a baby was not simply for health, it was to cleanse the child's soul, to protect it from the unseen. Even adults followed these customs. Before important days, a wedding, a journey, a harvest, one might bathe with special herbs: basil for courage, yarrow for protection, rue for purity. Men would anoint their swords, women would wash their hair under the first spring rain, not just for beauty, but to attract fortune, to drive away sorrow. Some believed illness came from the evil eye, a gaze too strong, a thought too jealous. To guard against it, they wore glass beads, drew circles in dust around their beds, placed bowls of salt beneath the floorboards. And when they washed not just dirt, but influence. In the woods far from town, there were those who knew more. Herbalists, cunning women, witch healers. They mixed soaps from lard and thyme. They made ointments with beeswax, honey and marigold. And they spoke softly, always softly, while they worked. Because words, too, could cleanse or curse. Not all magic was welcomed. The church walked uneasily beside these traditions. It tolerated what it could name, condemned what it could not. Holy water was the acceptable cleanser, sprinkled across thresholds, over beds, into wells. Priests would bless a new home, a child, even a chamber pot, if the owner asked kindly enough. But outside the walls, people trusted their own rituals, not always written, not always spoken aloud. A man might bury a louse-infested tunic beneath a yew tree during the waning moon. A woman might burn her comb after a fever, whispering a verse as the teeth blackened in the fire. Because cleanliness was more than appearance. It was protection, it was armour. In cities struck by plague, people walked with wax figures tied to their waists, bathed in vinegar laced with sage, lit candles carved with runes. Not science, but solace. Even the act of sweeping a floor could become a spell. If done clockwise with the right words, it could sweep away sorrow. If done widdershins, it could banish lingering spirits. And when someone died, the mirrors were covered. The water in the basin was poured out. The body washed not just with water, but with whispered prayers to ensure the soul would not linger. There was a deep and persistent belief that the body was a vessel, that it absorbed more than dirt, that it carried grief, envy, shadows, and light. And so to clean it was to release what the eye could not see. Even when soap was scarce, even when cloth was ragged, even when water was cold and clouded with ash, people still believed in the power of ritual. A lavender sprig tucked into a bodice, a silver ring dipped in spring water, face washed beneath starlight. These too were hygiene, not of the flesh, but of the spirit. Now, as the herbs in the fire crackle to silence and the moon hangs heavy and bright beyond the window, we step quietly back from the circle. In our next journey, we will explore the role of gender, how hygiene was shaped not only by class and season, but by the expectations placed on men and women, boys and girls, and the invisible burdens they carried in body and mind. But for now, hush. Let the spell rest. Let the warmth of ritual wrap around you, and sleep. Clean in ways the world no longer remembers. The world in every century has drawn lines, seen and unseen, between who may speak, who may work, who may touch, and who must wait. In the Middle Ages, those lines were drawn deep, and they touched everything, even the way one cleaned their body. Tonight we walk the quiet corridors of gender, to understand how the expectations of man and woman, boy and girl, shaped hygiene, not just in habit, but in meaning, not just in what was washed, but what was watched. Let us begin with the woman. She wakes before the sun, before the fire is kindled, before the children stir, before the cockerel has cried. In the hush of that early hour, she pours cold water into a basin and washes her face, not for vanity, but for readiness. She ties back her hair, combs through it with careful fingers, checks for lice, not because she has time, but because she does not. A medieval woman was expected to be clean, not sparkling, not perfumed, but proper. Her shift must be fresh, her nails not blackened, her hair hidden beneath a veil or wimple if she were married. To be unkempt was to be suspect. To be too kempt was worse. Vanity in a woman could be dangerous. To spend too long bathing, to own a silver mirror, to paint the lips with crushed berries, these were all signs of sin, of seduction, of something that might draw the eye, and thus the blame. So she walked a narrow path, clean enough to be respectable. Not so clean as to be noticed. Her duties required constant touch, flour, ash, blood, soap, linen, mud. She cleaned others, her children, her husband, the sick, the dying, and often she herself remained unwashed until nightfall, when the house quieted, when no one could see. And then a bowl of water, a cloth, a quiet moment. But even that moment belonged to someone else, because her body was not her own. It was vessel, servant, symbol. She was expected to remain untouched before marriage, and yet always prepared for touch after it. To be desirable but modest, fertile but pure, and every whisper of dirt could call that balance into question. And yet women found ways. They brewed oils, they steeped herbs, they gathered together at bathhouses when allowed. They shared remedies, tucked rosemary into their hems, rinsed their mouths with wine steeped in mint. They passed down knowledge from mother to daughter, secrets kept in scent and steam. And what of men? A different burden. The medieval man was not judged by cleanliness in the same way. Sweat was strength, musk was masculinity, filth was forgiven, even expected, so long as it came from toil or battle. Yet men had their own rituals. The night before donning armour, bathed in preparation for mass or war. He oiled his beard, inspected his nails, ensured no lice crawled beneath his mail. The monk, bound by rule, washed daily, his hands, his face, his feet, not from pride, but obedience. The farmer rinsed only what was needed. Hands, arms, eyes, stung by dust. He wiped his face with his sleeve. He scoured his tools cleaner than his own skin. The merchant bathed more often, wore linen under his tunic, perfumed his cloak with cloves to mask the scent of travel. He lived in public, and cleanliness became currency. But even among men, class dictated access. A nobleman had servants to fetch water, to clean his garments, to brush his hair. A peasant had the stream, and time if he was lucky. Yet among men, dirt did not draw suspicion. A smudge on the face was not seen as weakness, an odour was not shame. It was women who bore the scrutiny. Always. Even in sickness, a woman was expected to remain neat. Even in labour, her linens were judged. Even in mourning, she was to be veiled, modest, composed. A man could stagger from the tavern, mud on his boots. A woman, if seen unkempt, might lose everything: work, safety, name. And for children too, the divide began early. Little boys ran wild, mud up to their knees. Their dirty faces drew smiles. Little girls were told to sit still, to wash before meals, to keep their dresses clean, even if their brothers did not. And so hygiene was never just about water or soap. It was about control, about roles, about the silent weight of expectation. Still within that weight there was resilience. Women who kept rosewater in jars despite hardship. Men who sat beside a sick child and wiped their brow clean. Girls who combed their sisters' hair beneath starlight. Boys who fetched water for their mothers in silence. Because beneath the rules and rituals there was something older. A need to care, to comfort, to protect. Now as the last coals die in the hearth and the veil is hung upon the peg, let us step back, let the comb rest, let the cloth dry. In our next journey we will enter the world of cleanliness and religion, where purity was more than health and the body was a temple not of beauty but of grace and repentance. But for now, breathe. Let the weight slip from your shoulders and sleep as if the world saw you only in kindness and never in judgment. The bells begin to toll in the distance, slow, deep, reverent. Their sound spills across the rooftops and ripples through the air like incense through a chapel. It is time for prayer, and with it, another kind of cleansing. Tonight, we enter the realm of faith, not the thunderous proclamations from pulpits or the bright festivals in the village square, but the quiet rituals of purity, the soft, sacred intersection where body and spirit met, where washing was not simply habit, but devotion. In the medieval world, cleanliness and religion were intertwined, not always in ways we would recognise, but deeply. Every drop of holy water, every foot washed before entering a chapel, every baptism whispered over the crown of a child's head, these were acts of hygiene woven into the very soul. Let us begin with the church itself, a place of stone, of shadow, of candlelight flickering against walls, rubbed smooth by generations of touch. At the door, a basin of holy water, the stoup, where the faithful dip their fingers and cross themselves, to bless the body, to ward off evil, to remind the flesh of its impermanence. Hands unwashed from labour were cleansed by ritual, not scrubbed, not lathered, but purified in the eyes of heaven. For monks and nuns, cleanliness was a rule. In the Benedictine order, the care of the body was outlined in chapters, instructions to bathe regularly, to wash hands before meals, to keep garments and dormitories free from filth. Not for comfort, but for order, for humility, because to be clean was to be worthy of prayer. And so monasteries built lavatoriums, long stone basins with flowing water, where monks would stand in silence and wash, sleeves rolled high, eyes lowered. Infirmaries had their own linens, their own washing stations, their own rhythms of quiet tending. But for the average villager, cleanliness came in moments. Holy moments. The first and perhaps most sacred, baptism. A newborn child, squirming, wailing, tiny, was brought to the church wrapped in wool. There, beneath the vault of the nave, the priest would anoint the head with oil and pour water over the scalp, 3 times, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. This was not merely symbolic, it was believed to wash away original sin, to make the child clean in the eyes of God, to begin life with purity, even if the world would stain it again. Later, as adults prepared for communion, they too sought cleansing, through confession, through fasting, through penance, Sin was seen as a kind of filth, clinging to the soul like grease to skin, and so people repented. They walked barefoot to the chapel, they wore sackcloth, they fasted for days till their bodies trembled and their mouths tasted of ash. This was hygiene for the spirit, but it extended to the body as well. On feast days, people bathed in rivers, in tubs, in borrowed basins. They donned their cleanest clothes, they oiled their hair, because to come before God was to be presentable, not proud, but prepared. Priests washed before Mass, not only their hands, but their faces, their lips. Each part of the body that would touch the host or speak the sacred words was ritually cleansed. Even death required its rites. The body of the departed was washed before burial, not only as a farewell, but as a spiritual preparation, a final act of mercy, a return to the purity of baptism. And yet cleanliness could also condemn. Women seen as too clean, too adorned, too perfumed, were accused of vanity or worse. Bathhouses, once blessed spaces of renewal, became suspect. Whispers of sin clung to steam-filled rooms. Some were shuttered, others watched closely by the eyes of clergy. In times of plague, when bodies festered and spirits trembled, processions were held. Barefoot, solemn, silent, people carried relics, burned herbs in censers, baptized entire towns in holy water, trying to wash away the wrath of heaven. But belief shifted. Over centuries, as superstition grew, cleanliness began to take on new meaning. Some claimed that water opened the pores and let sickness in, that bathing too often weakened the body and offended God. And so habits changed. Instead of washing, people anointed themselves with oils. They carried prayer beads rubbed smooth by anxious fingers. They sprinkled their clothes with sanctified water. And they prayed, always prayed. Still, even in the darkest corners, the connection remained. To clean the body was to honour the gift of life, to tend it with reverence as one might a candle lit for the Virgin. And so, in every small act, a face washed before Mass, a linen shift sewn fresh for Easter, a child's hands rinsed before evening prayers, hygiene lived, not in pursuit of beauty, but in reverence. Now, as the final bell tolls across the countryside and the stars rise like blessings above the quiet earth, we step out from the chapel. Our footsteps echo across the stone. The water in the stoup still ripples. In our next journey, we'll walk through the lives of the labourers, those whose work covered them in dirt, soot, blood, or worse, and yet who found their own rhythms of cleansing, hidden beneath sweat and toil. But for now, let the candles burn low, let the scent of incense fade, and sleep as if wrapped in robes of white, the soul at peace, the body at rest. Dawn stretches slowly over the fields, turning frost to dew, shadow to light. And with it comes the sound of life awakening, boots in mud, whetstones on blades, the low grunt of oxen pulling toward the plough. This is not the world of sermons or silk, it is the world of labour, of backs bent beneath burden, of hands that never quite come clean. Tonight, we walk among the workers, the ones who built the walls, tilled the soil, hauled the stones, and whose bodies bore the imprint of effort, calloused, stained, and weary. Let us begin in the fields. The ploughman rises before the sun. His breath clouds in the morning chill. He pulls on his tunic, still damp from yesterday's sweat. There is no time for washing, only for work. The earth clings to him under his nails, in the creases of his wrists, on his feet wrapped in rough wool or bare to the dirt. Yet he washes in his own way. He scoops water from a trough, splashes his face, rubs his hands together until the skin glows red. Not for cleanliness, but clarity, to wake, to shake off the ache of sleep. And at dusk, he does the same. When the fields are quiet and the tools hang on their pegs, he sits at the edge of a stream. He peels off layers of sweat-soaked cloth, scrubs his arms with sand or moss or leaves. He does not speak. There is no need. The water says enough. The blacksmith lives in another kind of dirt. His is the dirt of ash, of fire, of metal. His skin is darkened not by the sun, but by soot. He bathes rarely, not from indifference, but exhaustion. Each day he wipes his brow with the same cloth, rinses his hands in a barrel black with use. His nails are rimmed in charcoal. His clothes stiff with dust and sweat, but he keeps his tools clean, polishes his blades, scrubs his forge with a bristle brush made of wire. The irony is not lost, that steel must gleam, even if skin cannot. The butcher knows blood. It stains his apron, his sleeves, the floor beneath his feet. He sharpens his knives with care, but his hands, always his hands, are streaked with crimson. He rinses them often, not out of revulsion, but routine. A bucket beside the block, a rag over the shoulder, water, already pink, thrown into the street when it becomes too thick. He washes at the end of the day, not to be clean, but to be able to hold his child without passing the smell of death. The tanner walks alone. His work is foul, the worst of all. To turn hides into leather, he must soak them in lime and urine in animal dung. The pits where he works are rank. The fumes cling to him. No one sits beside the tanner at market. Few speak to him unless they must. And yet his hands are skilled, his wares prized. He washes in rivers far from the town, scrubs until his skin cracks. But the scent never leaves. Among all these, the washerwoman might seem the most fortunate. Surrounded by soap, by water, by the very tools of cleanliness, and yet her life is no cleaner than theirs. She kneels beside the stream, sleeves rolled, back bent, beats linen against stone, rubs lye into stains that will never quite lift. Her hands are raw, her joints ache. She smells not of flowers, but of effort. She has no time to wash herself, and still she returns, day after day, her own family's garments folded among the piles. Her own shift always last to be scrubbed. In towns, labourers gather in the tavern after work. They drink, they laugh, they shake dust from their sleeves. And sometimes, only sometimes, they visit the public baths. There, coins are exchanged for hot water, muscles unwind, and for a brief hour the grime of labour melts from the skin. They leave lighter, still tired, but clean, if only until morning. Hygiene for workers was a balance between survival and surrender. They washed what they could, endured what they could not, and always they returned to the same tasks, the same stains, the same sweat. Yet, beneath the grime, there was pride, in the neatness of a sharpened plough, in the weight of a well-worn apron, in the ritual of rinsing a day's worth of labour from tired hands. Because for them, cleanliness was not about appearance, it was about reclaiming the body, if only briefly, from the world that demanded everything from it. Now as the workers lie sleeping, their tools resting beside hearths or hanging in barns, we step away. The night is quiet. The stars look down with indifference and awe. In our next journey, we will explore the rare and curious luxury of the bathhouse, where steam, water and company collided in spaces both healing and scandalous. But for now, let your hands fall still, let the ache fade from your back, and sleep as though your labour has been honoured by the silence of the stars. The night grows warmer now, and from the heart of the city rises a gentle plume of steam. Soft laughter filters through the narrow alleys. Lanterns sway, casting long reflections on wet stone, and behind a wooden door carved with curling symbols, water waits. Tonight we enter the bathhouse, a space unlike any other in the medieval world, where filth met fire, where strangers disrobed, and where, for a fleeting hour, the grime of the world could be washed away, or merely shifted. Bathing in the Middle Ages was rare for most, but not absent. In certain towns and cities, public bathhouses stood like glowing islands amid the gloom. They bore many names: balnea, stews, thermae. Some were modest, others elaborate, but all shared a purpose: to clean, to soothe, to socialise, and sometimes to sin. Let us step inside. The first thing is the heat. It greets you like breath, curling over your skin, seeping into your clothes. The air is thick with steam and the scent of herbs, sage, mint, juniper. Voices murmur through the mist. Feet slap gently against wet stone. You are led into a chamber where the walls are damp and glowing. Wooden benches line the sides. Water drips softly from the ceiling, a lullaby of warmth. You disrobe, not in shame, but as everyone else does, slowly, carefully, folding your garments into a bundle. Modesty is a ritual here, even when nudity is common. The baths are filled by hand. Boiling water from great copper kettles is poured into deep wooden tubs, then cooled with buckets from nearby wells. The attendants, often women, sometimes men, work with quiet efficiency, stirring the water, laying out cloths, offering small cakes of soap made with ash and lard. In wealthier bathhouses, separate rooms offer separate sensations. The sudatorium, where you sweat. The caldarium, where you soak. The frigidarium, where you gasp from cold. And in between, a chamber to rest, to sip ale, to eat bread, to share secrets. Cleanliness is only part of the purpose. The bathhouse is a place of meeting. Merchants close deals here, their feet soaking in hot water. Lovers exchange glances through steam. Wives whisper rumours behind drawn curtains. Pilgrims scrub their backs and pray for forgiveness. For a few pennies, you can rent time in a tub. More, and you may request a massage. Oil rubbed into your shoulders, your feet kneaded until the ache subsides. And for more still, other services may be offered. Not all bathhouses are innocent. Some double as brothels. Their signs bear discreet markings. Their doors open only to those who know how to knock. This duality gave bathhouses a certain reputation, 1 foot in luxury, 1 foot in temptation. As a result, the church often condemned them. Preachers warned against the mixing of naked bodies, against the indulgence, against the idle talk that might bloom into sin. Some towns closed their bathhouses entirely during Lent. Others allowed them but posted warnings outside, keep your soul clean, not just your skin. And yet, people returned. Because the bath was not simply indulgence, it was relief from lice, from ache, from the endless weight of labour. Even in rural areas, smaller stews existed, run by families, open once a week, heated with firewood gathered all summer. Neighbours came together, men on one day, women the next. They bathed, not in silence, but in song. Laughter echoed off the rafters, children splashed, old wounds were soothed, the soap was coarse, the water sometimes murky. But for a moment you were clean, and that moment mattered, not just for the body, but for the mind, for the sense that the world, for all its filth and weight, could be rinsed away. Even for the poor, bathing occurred when possible. A borrowed tub, a wash in the river, a pot of boiled water poured slowly over the back, and always the same rhythm: scrub, rinse, exhale. In time, as plague struck and fear of contagion grew, bathhouses became more suspect. Some were closed for good, others transformed into inns, taverns, or simply left to crumble. But their memory lingered, in the shape of old stones near rivers, in the stories passed down, in the word bath itself, a promise that cleansing was once communal. Now, as the water cools and the candles burn low, we step away from the warmth. Garments are donned once more, hair drips down the back. The streets outside are dark, but the body is lighter. In our next journey, we will explore the homes of the wealthy, not castles but manors and townhouses, to understand how the upper classes maintained appearances of cleanliness, even as the truth lay beneath polished wood and painted walls. But for now, let your limbs loosen. Let the steam fade into dream and sleep, as though your skin still hums with heat, wrapped in water and silence. The night deepens, and a hush settles over manicured gardens and shuttered windows. The torchlight flickers gently along cobbled courtyards, casting long shadows on stone archways and polished wood. Tonight, we pass through iron gates and into the homes of the wealthy, not kings or queens in their towering castles, but merchants, magistrates, noble families. The gentry, the privileged, those who dwelled in manor houses and townhomes, where cleanliness was performed as spectacle but rarely achieved beneath the surface. Here, appearances reigned. A gentleman's cloak was brushed clean each morning. A lady's chemise was changed regularly, often perfumed with rosewater or orange blossom. Their floors were swept daily, their linens aired, their combs carved from ivory. But beneath the lavender and linen, hygiene remained elusive. Let us begin in the manor. A sprawling estate of timber and stone with leaded glass windows and painted beams. The scent inside is faint, beeswax, aged oak and something else, something older. In the master's chamber, a washstand stands near the window. A polished basin of pewter, a pitcher of cool water, a neatly folded towel. Every morning a servant pours fresh water for the lord and lady. They rinse their hands, dab their faces. Sometimes they add herbs, chamomile, rosemary, lemon balm, to give the illusion of freshness. But full-body bathing is rare, perhaps once a month, perhaps less. A wooden tub is brought into the room. Water must be heated in the kitchen below and carried up by pail. Servants fill the bath, adjusting the temperature, adding petals, oils or wine. The lady bathes first, then the lord, then perhaps the children, and sometimes the same water is used throughout. The tub is emptied out the window or into a drain that leads eventually into the moat or a ditch behind the garden wall. Cleanliness here has limits. In townhouses, the space is tighter, the wealth remains, but the air is closer. The city presses in from all sides, smoke, sweat, dung. To protect themselves, the wealthy surround their homes with symbols of refinement. Curtains thick with embroidery, rushes scented with dried lavender and thyme, tapestries to warm the walls. But these coverings too hide dirt. Mice nest in the rushes. Lice dwell in the tapestries. Bedrooms are swept but not mopped. Chimneys are rarely cleaned. Beds are grand, but their straw mattresses are seldom replaced. The warmth of feather quilts hides the smell of unwashed bodies. Yet the wealthy do what they can. They own multiple garments, fresh shifts, fine underclothes, linen handkerchiefs. These are sent to laundresses in the town or washed in the manor's own washhouse, boiled in vats, scrubbed on wooden boards, dried in the sun. Servants carry baskets of clothing on their backs, sometimes miles at a time. The lady of the house has her own methods. She applies scented powder beneath her arms, rubs her feet with rose oil, wears gloves when touching others. She combs her hair daily, perhaps with a maid's help, detangling, oiling, braiding. If lice appear, as they often do, her bedding is shaken, her scalp combed with vinegar-soaked teeth, her veils boiled. She does not scrub her face. Instead, she patters it with milk or a paste of crushed almonds. To be pale is to be noble. Sun-darkened skin is for peasants. The gentleman is no different. He wears a ruff or collar, always starched, always white. His beard is trimmed with care, perfumed lightly. He does not bathe often, but he washes his hands before meals, a habit more ceremonial than sanitary. The manor has privies, small, enclosed rooms with stone or wooden seats built over chutes or pits. Sometimes they empty into cesspools, sometimes into the moat. Servants are paid to clean them, to shovel out waste, to sprinkle lime, to cart it away by night. Even this is a luxury, because the poor do not have privies. They have buckets, fields, corners. In the manor kitchen, hygiene dances a careful line. Cooks wipe knives on aprons. Raw meat is rinsed in the same basin where herbs are washed. Water is fetched daily, but not boiled unless needed. The pantry is cool, but not sterile. Still, the food is rich, and with it the risk. The wealthy suffer from their own indulgences. Gout, tooth rot, foodborne illness. Their gums swell, their stomachs revolt. But they rarely connect the sickness to the cleanliness of their kitchens or the state of their hands. Instead, they call for a physician. He bleeds them, prescribes sweet syrup, recommends prayer. And so, life goes on. Behind closed shutters and polished floors, cleanliness remains a veil, maintained by others, never questioned aloud. Servants work tirelessly. Laundresses boil the clothes, stable boys scrub the floors, maids empty the chamber pots, they clean the house, even as they live in its shadows. Now, as the candlelight flickers across a marble basin and the hush of wealth settles in, we slip away from the manor's warmth. In our next journey, we will explore the world of water itself, how rivers, wells and springs became both saviours and sources of sickness, shaping the course of hygiene across every class. But for now, breathe in the scent of rose oil and candle wax. Let the silk sheets fall, and sleep beneath a ceiling painted with stars while the water waits below. Beneath every village, every field, every city wall, there runs a hidden thread, a sound that murmurs softly through stone and soil, through reed and root. Water. The giver of life, the washer of hands, the quencher of thirst, and sometimes the harbinger of death. Tonight we follow the flow, from bubbling springs to brimming wells, from sacred rivers to stagnant ditches, to understand how medieval people drew water, used it, feared it, revered it, and how, in the search for cleanliness, water could be both blessing and curse. Let us begin at the well. At the centre of every village there stood one, circular, walled, often covered with a simple roof to keep leaves and animals from falling in. Women gathered there each morning, balancing buckets from yokes across their shoulders. Children fetched water under watchful eyes. It was a place of necessity and community. Water from the well was often cool, even sweet, especially in spring, but it was not always clean. The well was fed by underground springs, but it could also be tainted by surface runoff. Waste, manure, rot from nearby middens. No one boiled drinking water unless illness was already suspected. To them, clear water meant safe water. Taste was the judge. Clarity the proof. If the well grew cloudy or smelled of sulphur, it was cursed, a sign of sin nearby. Sometimes priests were called to bless it. Sometimes it was abandoned entirely. In towns, wells multiplied. Private households dug their own, shallow and closer to waste pits. The risk grew. And so some turned to rivers. The river was life. It gave fish, it turned mill wheels, it fed crops through irrigation ditches. It was a place to wash bodies, clothes, vegetables, wounds. But the river was also used to carry waste away. Tanners poured chemicals into it. Butchers rinsed blood from their knives into it. Chamber pots were emptied near its banks. Dead animals floated downstream, and yet people still drank from it. They filled jugs at sunrise, hoping the water at first light was purer. They avoided drawing near certain places, bends where refuse collected, places where the current slowed. Some whispered about water spirits. Others watched the birds. If they drank, the water was safe. Monasteries, when well built, managed water better. Cistercian monks, for example, engineered channels and cisterns. They directed fresh water into cloisters and kitchens. They built latrines over flowing streams that carried waste away from living quarters. For a time, these were the cleanest places in Europe, a quiet marvel of stone thought and flow. But not all had the luxury of channels. In most homes, water had to be fetched daily. For drinking, for cooking, for washing hands, feet, pots, laundry. Once brought inside, it sat in barrels, grew stale, turned green. Rainwater was collected from roofs into cisterns, fresher but still at risk of contamination. Leaves floated, insects laid eggs, and when drought came, everything changed. Cleansing halted, laundry delayed, baths forgotten, rivers shrank, wells dried. The little water that remained went to animals first, then to drinking. In such times, people turned to wine or ale. Not the strong liquors we know now, but small ale, a weak, fermented drink that was boiled during brewing, making it safer than most water. Even children drank it. It was not about intoxication. It was about survival. There were sacred waters, too. Springs said to heal the sick. Wells blessed by saints. Pilgrims journeyed days to reach them, dipping cloth into basins, pressing wet fingers to wounds, drinking in hope. These places were kept cleaner, out of reverence. Offerings were left at their edges, coins, flowers, broken crutches. But even they were not immune to time. Algae grew, moss crept in, rats drank as often as men. And so the medieval relationship with water remained one of paradox. It was necessary, it was dangerous, it was sacred, it was feared. It could clean the body, it could carry disease, it could bless a child, it could drown a town. And yet, day after day, people returned to it. They carried it home, they knelt beside it, they trusted it because they had no choice. And in that trust, they forged rituals, whispered blessings before drinking, sprinkling water across doorways, letting it wash away more than dirt, letting it carry away pain, silence, worry. Now, as the stream outside babbles low under moonlight and the well stands quiet under stars, we step away. The buckets are empty, the barrels are full, and the water waits for morning. In our next journey, we will rise above into the world of medicine to see how medieval healers understood the body, the humours, and how their attempts to cleanse illness often tangled health and harm in the same breath. But for now, let the current carry your thoughts. Let the river run soft through your dreams and sleep as though the water were clear, cold and endless. The candle burns low in the apothecary's chamber. Herbs hang from rafters like sleeping bats, dried sage, yarrow, chamomile, wormwood, each tied in neat bundles with twine. Pestles rest beside worn mortar bowls, stained by years of grinding root and resin. And in the dim light, a man leans over a patient, eyes tired, hands steady. This is not a doctor in the way we understand it today. This is a medieval healer, a practitioner of humours, of balance, of rituals half scientific, half sacred. Tonight we step into the world of medieval medicine, where hygiene was not just a hope, but a theory, where cleaning the body meant rebalancing the soul, and where the very act of washing could be both healing and harm. To begin, we must understand the humours. The body, it was believed, was governed by 4 elemental fluids: blood, flood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. When these humours were in harmony, the body thrived. When one rose too high or fell too low, sickness crept in, fevers, rashes, melancholy, madness. And so the goal of the healer was not simply to remove dirt, but to restore balance. Cleanliness, then, was not about surface. It was about internal harmony. A man with a fever might be bled, his veins opened with a lancet, the blood collected in a ceramic bowl. Too much heat in the body, they said, he must be cooled. And so a cloth soaked in vinegar and rosewater would be laid upon the forehead, his feet rinsed in cold water, his skin sponged with wine infused with mint, but not bathed, no. Full bathing was often avoided during illness. Why? Because many believed that warm water opened the pores, and through open pores, bad air, miasma could enter. Better to sponge the skin, they thought. Better to anoint than immerse. In cases of skin disease, ointments were prepared, rendered fat mixed with herbs, honey blended with crushed nettle. They were smeared over rashes, abscesses, sores. And yet, hygiene was imprecise. Cloths were reused, bowls were seldom cleaned, water was fetched from wells tainted by waste, hands went unwashed between patients. In monasteries, healing was more careful. Monks kept infirmaries, quiet rooms with clean straw beds and windows for air. They washed patients' feet, they changed bandages, they scrubbed floors with vinegar. Still, they had no knowledge of germs, only observation, only pattern, and some patterns helped, washing wounds with wine. Boiling linen, separating the sick from the well. But beyond the monastery, medicine was often desperate. Barber surgeons bled patients beside marketplaces. They lanced boils with unclean knives. They drained abscesses into the gutter. And yet, people lined up because they were suffering, and suffering demanded action. In homes, healing fell to mothers, wives, grandmothers. They brewed teas from elderflower, chamomile, and mugwort. They bathed the feet of the fevered. They sponged brows. They sang while they worked, sometimes prayers, sometimes lullabies. There was comfort in these acts, even when they did not cure, even when they brought little relief. Healers knew that warmth could soothe, that clean linen made the bed feel less like a tomb, that the scent of lavender could ease a restless mind. But they also feared contagion. When plague came, doctors wore long robes, gloves, and beaked masks filled with herbs, a barrier against bad air. They carried canes to avoid touching the sick. They burned sulphur. They washed with vinegar. They fled when they could, and still, the sickness came. For the dying, washing became a rite. The body was sponged if possible, the hands, the feet, the face, to ease the passage, to honour the vessel. And once the soul was gone, the body was washed again. A final gesture, a final hope. For the living there were tonics, to purify the blood, to cleanse the liver, to calm the bowels. These were not always safe. Some contained mercury, some arsenic, some mould that killed faster than the fever itself. But the effort mattered. In towns, physicians began to carry cloths scented with vinegar and spices. They recommended washing floors, airing rooms, burning herbs. They wrote treatises in Latin and French on how to live clean, eat well, avoid bad air. These writings were shared, copied, debated. And slowly, painfully slowly, the understanding began to shift. Not fully, not clearly, but the seed of something better was there. That water could heal, that clean cloth mattered. That hands, when washed, saved lives. Now, as the apothecary corks his final bottle and the patient sleeps, not healed but quieter, we step away. The herbs rustle in the rafters, the candle burns low, and the night hums with quiet hope. In our next journey, we will explore the silence of things not said, the taboos, the hidden hygiene of intimacy, menstruation, and bodily functions that were cloaked in shame, secrecy, and whispers behind doors. But for now, let the oil lamps dim, let the mortar rest and sleep, as though someone had placed a cool cloth upon your brow and stayed beside you till dawn. The night is deep now, a silence thicker than sleep presses against the world, broken only by the soft crackle of fire or the distant howl of wind past shuttered windows. It is in this hush that we turn toward the unspeakable, the hidden, the ordinary, and yet unspoken. Tonight, we enter the most private corners of medieval life, the hygiene of intimacy, of menstruation, of sex, of the body's unbidden functions, topics left out of sermons and chronicles, but not out of life. These were the parts no one discussed, not in the square, not in song, only behind doors in whispers. Yet they shaped the daily rhythm of every soul. Let us begin with the woman's cycle. There was no term as clinical as menstruation. It was known as the courses, or the moon's flow, or simply the time. It arrived without instruction, often without warning. Mothers told daughters what they could, usually in brief, sometimes with fear. It was seen as a necessary discomfort, sometimes a punishment, sometimes a mystery. The church taught that Eve's sin had brought it upon women, and so blood was shameful, impure, a reminder of weakness, of flesh. But women had to manage it nonetheless. They used cloth, strips of linen folded and pinned in place or tied with a belt. These were washed in secret, boiled in water with vinegar or ash, hung to dry away from the eyes of men. Sometimes moss or wool was used, soft, absorbent, but dangerous if left too long. Infections were common, discomfort constant. Bathing during the courses was rare, feared. Some believed it would cause the blood to stop too soon. Others believed it would cause too much to flow. And yet women worked. They baked, they bled, they carried water, walked miles, laboured in the fields, always with the stain tucked away, always hiding. Sex, too, bore its own rituals and taboos. In marriage, it was expected, a duty, a transaction. But it was rarely discussed in the language of tenderness. Hygiene before and after was minimal. A cloth to wipe, a basin to rinse, little more. Yet women whispered among themselves about herbs that meant pregnancy, about tonics to cleanse the womb, about the strange discharges, the pains, the fears that came afterward. Men, for their part, were often careless. They washed when they remembered. They rarely considered infection. They trusted in strength, in nature, in prayer. Some carried scented cloths to mask the body. Some rubbed oils on their skin, not for health but allure. But most simply endured the smells, the sores, the sudden sicknesses. For those outside of marriage, intimacy was danger. Pregnancy meant ruin. Rumour meant exile. And so lovers met in barns, in woods, in shadows. Their acts fast, hushed, unfinished. Afterward there was little comfort, no warm bath, no cleansing salve, only cold, only fear. And what of defecation? A daily truth. A constant need, but never spoken. In towns, chamber pots were kept beside beds, emptied out windows in the morning, a cry of "Gardez-le" to warn the street below. In manors, privies were hidden in stone niches. Their chutes fell into pits or moats, sometimes lined with straw. In villages, people squatted behind hedges. In fields, in outhouses dug from clay and covered with boards, wiping was done with moss or leaves or rags, sometimes with nothing. The smell lingered. Clothing was rarely changed. Hands were rinsed only if water was near. To pass gas in company was shameful. To soil one's garments, disastrous. Children were taught early to be silent about the body, to wash discreetly, to endure discomfort. And so much was hidden. Pimples, itching, discharge, odours. Shame grew in the corners where hygiene could not reach, where the human body was most vulnerable, most real. Yet there were moments of gentleness. A mother rinsing her child's skin after an accident. A wife boiling cloth for her bleeding daughter. A midwife rubbing lavender oil on cracked thighs. A husband brushing his wife's hair while she ached with cramps. These quiet mercies stood against the silence. Acts of hygiene born not from duty, but care. And though they left no record in scroll or salt, they linger still in the folds of cloth, in the scent of crushed thyme. In the hush of a basin poured out behind a shutter. Now, as the fire fades and the house sleeps, we step gently away. The doors are closed, the secret's safe. In our next journey, we will explore the decline, how over time the loss of ancient knowledge and the rise of fear led Europe into even deeper filth before hope stirred again. But for now, draw the curtain, let the cloth fall and sleep, wrapped in silence like so many before you. The wind turns colder now. A stillness settles across the land, not the hush of peace, but the quiet of absence, a forgetting, a slipping away. Tonight we trace the long descent, the slow unravelling of knowledge, the abandonment of hygiene not through ignorance alone, but through fear, war, superstition, and the weight of a world in retreat. We walk now through the shadows of decline. Once, long ago, the Romans built aqueducts that arched like ribbons across the land. They brought water to cities, built bathhouses heated by hypercausts, engineered sewers that whispered beneath marble floors. Cleanliness was civic pride, public, visible. But as Rome fell and the centuries turned, stone by stone, that knowledge crumbled. What had been water became dust. What had been flow became stagnation. In many parts of Europe, especially in the West, the grandeur of sanitation faded. Bathhouses were abandoned, aqueducts cracked, wells went dry. And in their place, a kind of silence crept in. By the 10th century, bathing had become rare in many regions. The once common practice of public baths was now seen with suspicion, not only as indulgent but as sinful. Pleasure, after all, was danger, and where the unclothed gathered, sin was whispered to stir. The church, though never universally condemning cleanliness, became cautious. Clergy warned against the vanity of excessive bathing. They urged spiritual purity over bodily comfort. Confession replaced washing, mortification replaced massage, and still plagues came, each time worse, each time more bewildering. People stopped touching each other, stopped gathering, stopped bathing, not out of neglect but fear. The water, they said, might carry sickness. Bathhouses were closed, rivers were avoided, basins left unused. And in that fear the body was cloaked, garments layered, linens left on for weeks. Skin untouched by water except in death. Even royalty bathed less. Queen Isabella of Castile, it is said, bathed twice in her life, once at birth, once before her wedding. Whether truth or tale, the rumour spread far and wide, and many took pride in avoiding the bath, as though distance from water was a sign of piety or strength. In the courts of Europe, perfume replaced soap, powder replaced scrubbing, wigs covered lice-infested scalps, and rouge painted over blemishes caused by poor sanitation. The poor, of course, had little to replace what was lost. Their water came from ditches, their waste pooled in gutters, they washed when it rained, or not at all. Diseases spread, typhus, scabies, dysentery, all passed easily where no soap touched skin, where waste was tossed into streets, where hands remained unwashed between labour and meal. Physicians still spoke of humours, still bled their patients, still urged avoidance of wind and bad smells. They blamed the air, the stars, the sins of the flesh. Few spoke of the body's surface, of fingernails black with soil, of wounds left unclean, of water untouched. There were exceptions, always. In Constantinople, in Cordoba, in places where Roman or Islamic influence lingered, water remained sacred. Bathhouses continued in some cities. Hygiene was tied to ritual, to faith, to habit. But in much of Europe, the downward slope remained. Even as cathedrals rose, the body was forgotten. Even as tapestries grew thicker, skin beneath them festered. Even as gardens bloomed, the human form, that miraculous vessel, was left to rot in its own shell. And yet, the memory did not vanish entirely. In the monasteries, monks still cleaned the feet of strangers, still washed the sick, still heated water, even in winter, for those near death. In hidden corners, women passed down herbal recipes, clean linen, ways to bathe a child with snow or spring rain, not for vanity, but for comfort, for mercy. The idea of cleanliness lay dormant, like seed beneath frozen earth, waiting. Now, as the fire dies to ember and the past grows heavy behind us, we leave this moment of descent, not with despair, but with understanding, because even in forgetting, the longing remained, to be clean, to be light, to begin again. In our final journey, we will rise from these shadows. We will glimpse the stirrings of renewal, the rebirth of cleanliness, the rediscovery of water's grace, and the slow, beautiful return of the bath. But for now, hush, let the dust settle, let the moon keep watch, and sleep, knowing even the lost can be remembered. Dawn breaks pale and quiet. The long night of centuries begins to lift, as if the world itself stirs from a restless sleep. There is still fog upon the fields, still soot in the chimneys, still silence in the streets. But something has changed. Something breathes. Something returns. Tonight, we arrive at the end and at a beginning. The slow reawakening of hygiene, the return of the bath, the rediscovery of water, not as fear, but as salvation. It did not happen all at once. There was no sudden turning of the wheel. Rather, it began with questions. Why do some fall ill and others not? Why do wounds fester? Why do those who wash seem sometimes to survive? Whispers turned to ideas, ideas into studies, and slowly, painfully, knowledge began to rise. In the late Middle Ages and into the early Renaissance, the world stirred. Trade reopened. Scholars travelled. Texts once locked in monastery scriptoria were read again. From the east came echoes of ancient wisdom, Arabic medical texts, writings from Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, and with them came the old respect for the body. In cities like Florence, Paris and London, physicians began to emphasize cleanliness once more, not fully understanding microbes, but sensing something true. That clean wounds healed faster, that bad air lingered where filth did, that health was tied to more than humours alone. Bathhouses began to reopen, tentatively, carefully, often first for the wealthy. Large public bains in France, term in Italy, stews in England. Some still carried the weight of old suspicion tied to sin, to lust, but others were welcomed as places of healing. Designs improved, rooms were tiled, water channeled more cleanly. Hot and cold baths were separated, attendants trained in massage, in wound care. Soap, once rare, became a craft. Cities began producing it in quantity. Marseille, Aleppo, Castile, olive oil, lye, and herbs, hard bars that lathered, scented, soothed. Perfume, once used to mask filth, now followed cleanliness. The scented became not a disguise but a sign of care. Private households among the elite began installing rooms for bathing, small tubs of copper or wood, folding screens, tiled floors. Servants fetched hot water in shifts, families bathed weekly, sometimes more. In the countryside, the changes were slower. Streams were still the primary source. Laundry still done by river stone. But even there, the idea took hold that the body deserved tending. And not just in illness. Midwives resumed cleansing rituals for new mothers. Hospitals washed patients more often. Monks refined the lavatoriums in their cloisters. Children were taught to rinse their hands before eating. In cities, rudimentary sewers were dug. Gutters cleaned more regularly. Laws passed to regulate waste. Bathhouses taxed, licensed, protected. The church, too, began to soften. It never opposed cleanliness, but now it began to endorse it more openly. Cleanliness as a symbol of inner grace, of discipline, of humility. The Renaissance brought art, and art brought the body into view again, not cloaked in shame, but lit, sculpted, admired. Painters like Botticelli, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, they studied flesh, drew veins, muscles, eyes. They bathed their models in light, and the idea grew. The body was not merely a vessel of sin, it was beauty. It was divine. By the 17th century, personal hygiene was an emerging fashion, not yet modern, but close. People owned combs, soaps, scented cloths. They washed their hands, cleaned their teeth with powders, rinsed their mouths with mint and salt. Bathing was still limited by fuel, by plumbing, but the desire was there. And desire, as always, is where change begins. In time, science would give names to the unseen: bacteria, viruses, infection. But long before microscopes, people knew deep down that to bathe was to begin again, that to scrub away sweat was to reclaim the self. That water could hold something like forgiveness. And so the nightmare of medieval hygiene did not end with a thunderclap. It faded, was rinsed away, by steam, by soap, by the steady, stubborn will to be clean. Now, as the morning sunlight climbs the window pane and the world stands at the edge of another day, we rest. You've walked with kings and beggars, stepped through filth and prayer, seen the body in its most honest form, vulnerable, enduring, unseen. The Middle Ages did not forget cleanliness. It struggled toward it. It whispered it. It hid it beneath linen and behind veils of incense and fear. But the water always returned. It always does. And now, as your breath slows, as your thoughts drift soft and far, may your dreams be clear as spring rain, and your sleep as clean as still water in morning light.